The dirt beneath Violet Brennan's bare feet was hot enough to blister skin, but she barely felt it anymore as she stood in the town square of Bisbee, Arizona, watching her father shake hands with a stranger over a pair of brand-new leather boots. It was the summer of 1883, and the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small mining town nestled in the Mule Mountains, turning the air thick and shimmering with heat waves that made everything look like a fever dream. She had known her father was a drunk and a gambler, but she had never imagined he would sink this low, trading his only daughter like she was nothing more than livestock or property to be bartered away for whatever caught his fancy at the moment. The stranger who now owned her was a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey even from several feet away. His name was Silas Crowe, and he owned a saloon on the outskirts of town where the respectable folk never ventured. Violet was 20 years old, with long chestnut hair that fell in waves down her back and green eyes that had once sparkled with hope, but now held only resignation. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times the original pattern was barely visible, and her hands were rough from years of taking in laundry and mending clothes to help keep food on the table while her father drank away every cent he earned in the copper mines. "Come on then, girl," Silas said, reaching out to grab her arm with fingers that felt like iron bands closing around her flesh. "Got work for you at the saloon. You will earn your keep, that is for certain." Violet pulled back instinctively, but his grip only tightened. Her father would not even meet her eyes as he sat on the wooden bench outside the general store, already pulling on his new boots with the satisfied expression of a man who had just made a good bargain. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the shameful transaction began to disperse, most of them shaking their heads but none willing to intervene. In the Arizona Territory of 1883, a man's business was his own, no matter how distasteful others might find it. "Please," Violet whispered, though she was not sure if she was begging Silas for mercy or her father for a shred of decency she knew he did not possess. "There has to be another way." "There ain't no other way," her father said without looking up from admiring his boots. "I owed money to Silas here, and this squares us up. You are old enough to make your own way now anyhow." Before Silas could drag her away toward his saloon and whatever fate awaited her there, a voice cut through the dusty air like a knife. "Hold on there just a minute." Everyone turned to see a tall cowboy striding toward them from across the street. He wore dusty trail clothes and a battered hat pulled low over his eyes, but there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. His boots were worn nearly through at the heels. His shirt had been patched at the elbows, and he looked like he had not had a decent meal in weeks. But he walked with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. As he drew closer, Violet could see that he was young, probably no more than 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the sky just after dawn. "This doesn't concern you, Yates," Silas said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "Move along." The cowboy, whose full name was Yates Vinson, stopped a few feet away and pushed his hat back enough that everyone could see his face clearly. There was a thin scar running along his jawline, a souvenir from his years working cattle drives up from Texas, and his hands rested easily on his hips in a stance that was not quite threatening, but made it clear he was not backing down. "I am making it my concern. You cannot just buy a person like she is a piece of furniture." "Her daddy sold her fair and square to settle his debts," Silas said, his face reddening. "We got witnesses and everything. Now get out of my way before I have the sheriff run you out of town." Yates looked at Violet for a long moment, and something passed between them in that look, something that made her heart skip a beat, despite the desperate circumstances. Then he turned his attention to Violet's father, who was still sitting on the bench and looking decidedly uncomfortable now that someone was making a scene. "How much did he owe you?" Silas named a figure that made several of the onlookers gasp. It was more money than most miners made in 3 months of backbreaking work in the copper mines that honeycombed the mountains surrounding Bisbee. Violet felt her stomach sink. Even if this stranger wanted to help her, there was no way he could come up with that kind of money. He looked like he barely had 2 nickels to rub together. "And you gave him boots in trade for his daughter?" Yates asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Good boots," Silas said defensively. "Leather ones from back east, worth at least $15 on their own." Yates was silent for another moment, and Violet could see his jaw working as he thought through his options. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began unbuckling his gun belt. It was a well-worn rig with a Colt revolver that had seen better days but was clearly well-maintained. He laid it carefully on the bench beside Violet's father, then pulled off his hat and set it on top of the gun belt. His spurs came off next, the rolls still gleaming despite the dust that covered everything else he owned. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I am making you an offer," Yates said calmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "I have got $8.40 here. It is everything I own in the world. I am also offering you my gun, my hat, my spurs, my saddle which is over at the livery, and my horse. Her name is Belle, and she is a good cutting horse, worth at least $60 to the right buyer. That should more than cover what he owed you." The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Violet felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as she realized this stranger was offering to give up everything he owned to save her from a fate she did not want to think about too closely. She had never seen him before today, had no idea why he would do such a thing, but the fierce determination in his face told her he was not going to back down. Silas looked torn between greed and anger. The horse alone was probably worth more than what Violet's father had actually owed him, and the other items would fetch a decent price as well. But accepting this offer would mean backing down in front of half the town, and men like Silas Crowe did not like being made to look foolish. "I already made a deal with her father. A deal is a deal." "Then make a new deal with me," Yates said. "Everything I have got in exchange for letting her go free, no strings attached. She walks away from here with her freedom intact." Violet's father, who had been watching this exchange with growing alarm as he realized he might lose his new boots, suddenly spoke up. "Now wait just a minute. Those boots are mine. We already shook on it." Yates turned to look at him with such contempt that the older man actually flinched. "You sold your own daughter for a pair of boots. You don't get a say in this anymore." "She is my daughter," he blustered, but there was no real force behind his words. "Then act like a father instead of a piece of trash," Yates said flatly. He turned back to Silas. "What do you say? Do we have a deal?" For a long moment Silas said nothing, his piggy eyes calculating the value of everything Yates had offered against the satisfaction of winning this particular battle of wills. Finally, greed won out over pride, as it usually did with men like him. "Fine. But I want to see this horse first, make sure she is as good as you say." "She is over at the livery," Yates said. "We can walk over there right now." The whole crowd seemed to migrate toward the livery stable at the edge of town, everyone wanting to see how this unusual drama would play out. Violet found herself walking beside Yates, acutely aware of how close he was, and how her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She wanted to thank him, to ask him why he was doing this, but the words stuck in her throat. At the livery, Yates led out a beautiful bay mare with a white star on her forehead and intelligent eyes that surveyed the crowd with interest. She was indeed a fine horse, well-muscled and clearly well cared for despite Yates's obvious poverty. The livery owner, who had been watching the proceedings with interest, confirmed that Yates's saddle was worth at least $20 and was in good condition. Silas walked around the horse, checking her teeth and running his hands down her legs in a pretense of expertise, though everyone could see he knew as much about horses as a fish knew about flying. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we have got a deal, but I keep the boots too." "Fine," Yates said. He had already lost everything else. What did a pair of boots matter? Silas released Violet's arm and she stumbled back, hardly believing she was actually free. Her father, looking sullen now that his bargaining chip had been taken away from him, turned and walked off down the street without a backward glance at his daughter. Violet watched him go and felt nothing but relief that she would never have to see him again. The crowd began to disperse now that the excitement was over, people heading back to their daily routines and already starting to gossip about what they had witnessed. Violet stood in the dusty street outside the livery, suddenly aware that she had nowhere to go and no money to her name. She looked at Yates, who was standing beside his horse, his hand resting on her neck as he murmured something too quiet for Violet to hear. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out rougher than she had intended. "I don't know why you did that, but thank you." Yates turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw him smile, a small, sad expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "No woman should be traded like property, not for any reason. But you gave up everything you owned," she said, gesturing at the horse. "Your horse, your saddle, your gun. How will you survive out here without those things?" He shrugged, the gesture somehow making him look even younger and more vulnerable than before. "I will figure something out, I always do. What's your name?" She asked, though she already knew, had heard Silas say it earlier. "Yates Vinson," he said, extending his hand. "Most folks just call me Yates." She took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. "Violet Brennan. Most folks call me Violet." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Violet felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and unfamiliar that made her breath catch. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it was the kind of foolishness that poets wrote about, but that never happened in real life. But looking into Yates's eyes, she suddenly understood why people wrote songs and stories about moments like this. "What will you do now?" he asked, releasing her hand reluctantly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no money, no family except for a father who clearly wants nothing to do with me. I have been taking in laundry and mending clothes, but I don't even have a place to live now. I was staying in a boarding house, but the rent is due and I can't pay it." Yates frowned, clearly thinking hard about something. Then his face cleared and he nodded as if he had made a decision. "There is a ranch about 15 miles north of here, up in the mountains. It is owned by a widow named Martha Colton. Her husband died last spring, and she has been trying to run the place by herself with just a couple of hands who are getting too old to do much of the heavy work. I worked there for a few weeks last month, helping with the branding and such. She mentioned she needed someone to help with the house and the cooking. It doesn't pay much, but it includes room and board. If you want, I could ride up there with you and introduce you." "But you don't have a horse anymore," Violet pointed out. "We can walk," he said simply. 15 miles isn't so far if you take it slow and rest when you need to. We could make it in a day, maybe a day and a half at most." Violet hesitated, trying to think through all the angles. She did not know this man, had no reason to trust him except for the fact that he had just given up everything to save her from Silas Crowe. But what other choice did she have? She could not stay in Bisbee, not after what had happened today. The whole town would be talking about how her father had tried to sell her, and she would never be able to hold her head up here again. "All right," she said finally. "If you think this Mrs. Colton might be willing to give me a chance, then yes, I would like to go." "Good," Yates said, and his smile was a little wider this time, a little more genuine. "We should probably get started while there is still plenty of daylight left. Do you have anything you need to collect from where you were staying?" Violet thought about the boarding house and the small room she had been renting. She owned so little that it barely seemed worth going back for, but there were a few things that mattered to her. "I have some clothes and a few personal items. It won't take long to gather them up." "I will walk with you," Yates said. "Then we can get some supplies for the journey before we leave town." They walked through the streets of Bisbee together, and Violet was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Everyone in town would know what had happened by now, and she could feel their eyes on her back like physical touches. But with Yates walking beside her, tall and steady and somehow reassuring despite having just lost everything he owned, she found she could endure it. At the boarding house, the landlady was waiting with her arms crossed and a sour expression on her face. "I heard what happened down in the square," she said before Violet could even speak. "I want you out of my house. I run a respectable establishment, and I won't have that kind of scandal attached to my name." Violet felt her face flame with humiliation, but she kept her voice steady. "I just need to collect my things. I will be gone in 5 minutes." "See that you are," the landlady said, but she stepped aside to let Violet pass. Yates waited in the parlor while Violet climbed the stairs to her small room under the eaves. It took her even less than 5 minutes to gather her possessions into a worn carpetbag. She owned 3 dresses, including the one she was wearing, 2 sets of undergarments, a shawl her mother had made before she died 5 years ago, a small leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and a tin daguerreotype of her mother taken shortly before her death. It was not much to show for 20 years of living, but it was everything she had left of her old life. When she came back downstairs, Yates took the carpet-bag from her without a word and carried it himself. The landlady watched them leave with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, but Violet did not look back. That part of her life was over now, and whatever came next, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. Their next stop was the general store, where Yates used the $8.40 he had mentioned earlier to buy some basic supplies. He was careful with the money, counting every cent and making sure they got the best value for each purchase. He bought a small sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, a little salt pork, a tin of coffee, and 2 canteens for water. The store owner, who had witnessed the scene in the square, threw in some extra biscuits and a chunk of cheese without charging for them, perhaps feeling a little guilty about not having spoken up earlier. "That should see us through to the ranch," Yates said as they left the store, their arms full of supplies. "Mrs. Colton will feed us once we get there, and if she hires you on, you will get regular meals from then on." "What about you?" Violet asked as they walked toward the edge of town. "What will you do for work now that you have lost your horse and your gun? Those are pretty essential for a cowboy, aren't they?" Yates's expression grew somber. "They are, but I will figure something out. Maybe Mrs. Colton will have some work for me too, at least for a little while until I can earn enough to buy another horse. A man can't work cattle without a good horse, but there is always ranch work that needs doing on foot." They left Bisbee as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to set the whole world on fire. The road north was little more than a dirt track that wound through the mountains, following old mining trails and game paths. The air was still brutally hot despite the approaching evening, and Violet could feel sweat trickling down her back within the first mile. Yates set a steady but manageable pace, stopping frequently to let Violet rest and drink from one of the canteens. He did not talk much as they walked, but his silence was comfortable rather than awkward, and Violet found herself grateful for it. She needed time to process everything that had happened, to come to terms with how completely her life had changed in the space of a few hours. As they walked, she found herself stealing glances at him, trying to understand what kind of man would give up everything he owned for a complete stranger. He had a strong profile, with a straight nose and a firm jaw that spoke of determination and stubbornness in equal measure. His hands, when she could see them, were scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but they handled the supplies he was carrying with a gentleness that suggested he was capable of more than just rough labor. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the last mile or so. "Sure," he said, glancing over at her. "Why did you do it? Why did you give up everything to help me? You didn't know me. For all you knew, I could have deserved what was happening to me." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but intense. "My mother was sold when I was 10 years old. We were slaves on a plantation in Mississippi before the war. I watched her get sold to settle my master's gambling debts, just like what almost happened to you today. I never saw her again after that day. The war came a few years later and I ran off to join the Union Army, even though I was only 14 and too young to fight properly. After the war ended, I spent years trying to find her, but I never could. I don't even know if she is still alive." Violet felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "No reason you should have," he said with a slight shrug. "I don't talk about it much. Most folks out here in the territories don't care much about a man's past, only what he can do in the present. But when I saw what your father was doing, saw you standing there looking so lost and scared, all I could think about was my mother and how no one helped her that day. How everyone just stood around and watched like it was normal and acceptable for a human being to be bought and sold like livestock. I couldn't let it happen again, not if I had any power to stop it." "You gave up everything," Violet said quietly. "Your horse, your gun, your money. Those things meant your livelihood. How will you survive without them?" Yates smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look younger and more carefree than she had yet seen him. "Things are just things, Violet. They can be replaced. But you cannot replace a person's freedom or their dignity. What I did today, it was worth more than all I own. You are worth more than all I own." The words hung in the air between them, and Violet felt something crack open inside her chest. Some hard shell she had built up over years of disappointment and betrayal. She had to look away from him, because if she kept looking, she was afraid she might start crying, and she had promised herself years ago that she would never cry over her father or her circumstances again. But these would not be tears of sadness or anger. They would be tears of something else entirely, something she did not quite have a name for yet. They walked in silence for a while longer, and as the sun sank lower in the sky, the temperature finally began to drop to something more bearable. The mountains around them were alive with the sounds of evening, insects chirping and birds calling out as they settled in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound echoing off the rocks and making Violet shiver despite the warmth that still radiated from the ground beneath their feet. "We should probably find a place to camp for the night," Yates said as the light began to fade from the sky. "There is a good spot about another half-mile up the road, near a spring where we can refill our canteens and wash up a bit." They reached the spot just as the last light was fading from the sky, revealing a small clearing beside the road where a spring bubbled up from between the rocks, creating a small pool of clear, cold water. Yates set down the supplies and immediately set about gathering wood for a fire, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent many nights camping under the stars. Violet helped as best she could, though she quickly realized she had no practical experience with this kind of thing. She had lived in towns all her life, first in Tucson and then in Bisbee, and the closest she had come to camping was sitting on her back step on summer evenings. But Yates was patient, showing her how to arrange the kindling and where to find dry wood that would burn cleanly without too much smoke. Soon they had a small fire crackling cheerfully in the gathering darkness, and Yates used some of the cornmeal and water to make simple johnny cakes that they cooked on a flat rock he positioned at the edge of the flames. They ate the johnny cakes with some of the cheese from the general store, washing it all down with water from the spring that was so cold it made Violet's teeth ache. It was not fancy food by any stretch of the imagination, but after the stress and fear of the day, it tasted better than anything Violet could remember eating in a long time. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think about what might have happened to her if Yates had not intervened. "Tell me about yourself," Yates said after they had finished eating and were sitting beside the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds around them. "What was your life like before today?" Violet pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the night was still warm. "There is not much to tell, really. My mother died when I was 15, and after that it was just my father and me. He was never the same after she passed. He started drinking more, gambling more. We moved around a lot because he kept losing jobs or getting thrown out of boarding houses for not paying the rent. I took in laundry and did mending to try to keep us afloat, but it was never enough. He would always find a way to lose whatever money we managed to scrape together." "What about other family? Aunts, uncles, cousins?" "My mother's family cut her off when she married my father. He was not good enough for them, I guess. And his family, well, I never knew them. He never talked about them, and I always got the sense that there was some bad blood there, some falling out that happened before I was born." Yates nodded slowly. "So you have been on your own for a while now, really? Even before today?" "I suppose so," Violet said. "I never thought about it that way, but yes. I have been taking care of myself for years. Today was just the first time it became official." "You are stronger than you think," Yates said, his voice carrying a note of admiration. "Most people would have fallen apart in your situation, but you kept going, kept fighting to survive. That takes courage." Violet felt her face flush with pleasure at the compliment, though she tried to hide it by staring into the fire. "I just did what I had to do. There wasn't really any other choice." "There is always a choice," Yates said quietly. "You could have given up. You could have stopped caring, but you didn't. That says something about who you are as a person." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, and the stars came out overhead, more stars than Violet had ever seen in her life, spread across the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, a river of light that made her feel small and insignificant and somehow comforted all at the same time. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "What has your life been like since the war ended?" Yates leaned back, bracing himself on his hands and tilting his face up toward the stars. "Restless, mostly. I spent the first few years after the war trying to find my mother like I told you. I traveled all over the South, following leads that never panned out, talking to people who claimed they remembered her but whose stories never quite matched up. Eventually, I had to accept that I was probably never going to find her, that she might not even be alive anymore. That must have been hard, Violet said softly. It was, he admitted. But at some point you have to decide whether you are going to spend your whole life looking backward or whether you are going to start looking forward instead. So I came west, figured I would make a fresh start somewhere nobody knew me or cared about where I came from. I worked cattle drives, ranch work, whatever I could find. I saved up enough to buy Belle and my gear, and I thought I was finally starting to build something, a life of my own. And then you gave it all up for me, Violet said, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. Hey, Yates said, sitting up and turning to look at her directly. I need you to understand something. What I did today, I didn't do it because I felt obligated or because I thought you owed me something. I did it because it was the right thing to do, plain and simple, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, even knowing how it would turn out. But you lost everything, Violet protested. No, Yates said firmly. I gave up some things, sure, but I didn't lose anything that really mattered. Things can be replaced, Violet. Money can be earned again. But you only get one chance to do the right thing in a moment like that, one chance to stand up for what you believe in. I took that chance, and I don't regret it. Violet felt tears pricking at her eyes again, and this time she did not try to stop them. They spilled down her cheeks silently, catching the firelight as they fell. She was not sure if she was crying because of everything that had happened today, or because this man she had just met had shown her more kindness and decency than her own father had in years, or because she was starting to feel things for Yates that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Yates reached out hesitantly and brushed away one of her tears with his thumb, his touch gentle and careful. It's going to be all right, he said softly. I promise you, Violet, things are going to get better from here. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he was right and that the worst was behind her now. And looking into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and determination there, she found that she did believe him. Maybe it was foolish, maybe she was setting herself up for disappointment, but in that moment she chose to have faith that things really would get better. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. You don't have to thank me, he said, but he smiled as he said it, and his hand lingered on her cheek for just a moment longer before he pulled it back. They stayed up talking for a while longer, sharing stories about their lives and dreams for the future. Yates told her about the cattle drives he had worked, the miles of open range he had covered, the storms and stampedes and long, lonely nights under the stars. Violet told him about the books she loved to read when she could get her hands on them, the way she had taught herself to sew, by unpicking and studying the seams of fancy dresses she took in for mending, the secret hope she had harbored that someday she might save up enough money to open her own dress shop. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with them both, and Yates banked the fire while Violet spread out her shawl on the ground to sleep on. Yates gave her his bedroll without being asked, and when she protested, he simply said that he had slept on harder ground than this before and would be fine. He positioned himself on the other side of the fire, close enough that she could see him if she looked, but far enough away to be respectful of her privacy. Violet lay awake for a long time after Yates's breathing had deepened into sleep, staring up at the stars and thinking about how strange and unpredictable life could be. This morning, she had woken up in her rented room with no idea that by nightfall she would be camping in the mountains with a cowboy who had given up everything to save her from a terrible fate. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, whether Mrs. Colton would be willing to hire her or whether they would have to find some other solution. But somehow that uncertainty did not frighten her as much as it should have, because she was not alone anymore. She had Yates, at least for now, and that made all the difference. She finally drifted off to sleep with that thought in her mind, and for the first time in years, she did not have nightmares. They woke at dawn to the sound of birds singing in the trees and the soft light of early morning filtering through the branches overhead. Yates rekindled the fire and made coffee with the precious grounds he had bought in town, and they ate the last of the biscuits from the general store for breakfast. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it chased away the last cobwebs of sleep and left Violet feeling more alert than she had in days. They packed up their meager camp and set off again, following the winding road higher into the mountains. The air was cooler up here, and there were actual trees instead of just scrub, brush, and cacti. Pine and juniper grew thick on the slopes, and wildflowers dotted the meadows they passed through. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed, and Violet found herself falling in love with it despite her aching feet and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Yates kept up a steady stream of conversation as they walked, pointing out different plants and animals, telling her about the geology of the mountains and the history of the area. She learned that Bisbee had been founded less than 5 years ago, when copper was discovered in the mountains, and that the whole region was booming with miners and prospectors hoping to strike it rich. The Colton Ranch, he explained, had been here longer, established in the 1870s when this was still wild Apache territory, and a person took their life in their hands just by settling here. Mrs. Colton is a remarkable woman, Yates said as they stopped to rest beside a small stream around mid-morning. Her husband built the ranch from nothing, and when he died, everyone expected her to sell out and move back east where she came from. But she refused to leave. She said this was her home now, and she would die before she let anyone drive her away from it. She sounds formidable, Violet said, feeling a flutter of nervousness in her stomach at the thought of meeting this woman. She is, Yates agreed, but she is also fair and kind. If she hires you, she will treat you right and pay you what you are worth. And she doesn't hold with nonsense or prejudice. Her husband fought for the Union during the war, and they believed in treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. They reached the ranch just after noon, coming around a bend in the road to see a collection of buildings nestled in a valley between two ridges. There was a main house built of adobe and wood, a large barn, several corrals, and a few smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the meadows beyond, and Violet could see a couple of men working near the barn, too far away to make out clearly. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched them come up the road. She was in her mid-50s, Violet guessed, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a weather-beaten face that spoke of years spent outdoors. She wore a simple dress covered by a work apron, and her hands were on her hips in a no-nonsense stance. "Yates Vinson," she called out as they drew close enough to hear. "I heard you gave away that pretty horse of yours in town. Doing what exactly?" "The right thing, Mrs. Colton," Yates said, pulling off his hat respectfully. "The right thing." Martha Colton's sharp eyes took in Violet, assessing her from head to toe in a way that made Violet want to squirm but also made her lift her chin and meet the older woman's gaze directly. After a moment, Mrs. Colton nodded, as if Violet had passed some kind of test. "Come inside, both of you. You look like you could use a decent meal and some water. Then you can tell me what brings you all the way out here." The inside of the ranch house was cool and dim after the brightness of the day outside, and Violet's eyes took a moment to adjust. The main room was large and comfortable, with a stone fireplace at one end and a long wooden table in the center. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and orderly. It felt like a real home, Violet thought. The kind of place where people actually lived and worked and built their lives, not just a temporary stopping point like all the places she had lived with her father. Mrs. Colton gestured for them to sit at the table, then disappeared into what must have been the kitchen. She returned a few minutes later with a pitcher of cold water, 2 glasses, and a plate of cold roast beef and bread. "Eat," she commanded. "Then talk." They ate gratefully, and as they did, Yates explained what had happened in Bisbee the day before. He did not spare any details, telling Mrs. Colton exactly how Violet's father had tried to sell her to Silas Crowe, and how Yates had intervened by offering everything he owned. Mrs. Colton listened without interrupting, her face growing sterner with each detail but also showing flashes of approval when Yates described giving up his horse and gear. When he had finished, Mrs. Colton turned her attention to Violet. "And you, girl, what can you do? I am not running a charity here. If I hire you on, I need to know you can pull your weight." Violet sat up straighter, determined to make a good impression. "I can cook and clean, madam. I can sew and mend clothes. I have been taking in laundry for years, so I know how to get stains out and keep things looking nice. I can garden if you need help with that. I am a hard worker and I learn quickly. I promise I won't let you down." Mrs. Colton studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "All right, I will give you a trial period of 2 weeks. You will help with the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and whatever else needs doing around the house. In return, you get room and board plus $5 a month. After 2 weeks, if it is working out, we will make it permanent. Fair?" "More than fair," Violet said, feeling a surge of relief so strong it made her dizzy. "Thank you, Mrs. Colton. I won't let you down." "See that you don't," Mrs. Colton said, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice now. She turned to Yates. "And you? I suppose you need work too, now that you are horseless and gunless." "I would appreciate anything you have got available, madam," Yates said, "even if it is just temporary until I can earn enough to get back on my feet." "I have got plenty of work," Mrs. Colton said. "My 2 regular hands are good men, but they are getting on in years, and there is more work than the 3 of us can handle. I can pay you $20 a month plus room and board. You will sleep in the bunkhouse with the other hands. Does that suit you?" "It suits me fine, madam," Yates said, and Violet could see the relief in his face. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Colton said dryly. "You haven't seen how much work there is to do around here. Now, Violet, let me show you to your room and where everything is in the kitchen. Yates, you can take your things to the bunkhouse and then report to my foreman, Joe Mitchell. He is the one with the white mustache. He will put you to work." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity for Violet. She woke before dawn each morning to help Mrs. Colton prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent her days cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, and tackling the hundreds of small tasks that kept a ranch household running smoothly. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done before, but it was also satisfying in a way that taking in laundry from strangers had never been. Mrs. Colton was a demanding employer but a fair one, quick to correct mistakes, but also quick to praise work well done. She taught Violet how to manage a kitchen on a large scale, how to plan meals for working men who needed substantial food to fuel their labor, how to preserve and store food for the winter months ahead. She also taught her about ranch life, about the rhythms of the seasons and the work that needed to be done at different times of the year. Violet saw Yates every day, but usually only at meal times when all the hands gathered in the main house to eat. He looked happier than she had seen him in the brief time she had known him, his face tanned from hours in the sun, and his body moving with the easy confidence of a man doing work he was good at. He always made a point of catching her eye during meals, giving her a small smile or a nod that made her heart skip a beat every single time. The other hands, Joe Mitchell, and an older man named Pete Carson, treated her with respectful courtesy, never making her feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. They clearly thought highly of Yates, and Violet heard them telling Mrs. Colton that he was one of the best workers they had seen in years, someone who could turn his hand to anything and do it well. At the end of the 2-week trial period, Mrs. Colton called Violet into the parlor for what she said was a serious conversation. Violet went with her heart pounding, terrified that despite her best efforts she had somehow failed to meet expectations. But Mrs. Colton surprised her by smiling, a real warm smile that transformed her stern face into something almost grandmotherly. "You have done well, Violet, better than I expected, to be honest. I would like to keep you on permanently if you are willing to stay." "I am willing," Violet said quickly. "More than willing. Thank you, Mrs. Colton." "There is one more thing," Mrs. Colton said, her expression turning more serious. "I have noticed the way you and young Yates look at each other. I am not blind and I am not a fool. Now, I don't have any rules against my workers forming attachments to each other, as long as it doesn't interfere with the work getting done. But I want you to think carefully about what you are doing. Yates is a good man, one of the best I have met, but he is also someone who has spent most of his life drifting from place to place. Are you sure he is ready to settle down? Are you sure that is what you want?" Violet felt her face flush, but she did not try to deny what Mrs. Colton had observed. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "Everything has happened so fast. A month ago I didn't even know Yates existed, and now I can't imagine my life without him in it. But you are right that we need to take things slow and make sure we are both thinking clearly." "That is a wise answer," Mrs. Colton said, nodding approvingly. "Just remember that I am here if you need advice or just someone to talk to. I may seem like a tough old bird, but I remember what it was like to be young and in love. I wasn't always this gray and wrinkled, you know." Violet surprised herself by laughing, and Mrs. Colton joined in, and suddenly the distance between employer and employee seemed to narrow into something more like friendship. As summer deepened into fall, Violet and Yates found more opportunities to spend time together. Sometimes it was just a few minutes stolen during the day, a brief conversation while she was hanging laundry and he was working on fixing a fence nearby. Other times, on Sunday afternoons when the ranch work eased up a bit, they would go for walks together through the surrounding hills, talking about everything and nothing. Yates told her more about his childhood, about the horrors of slavery and the chaos of the war, but also about the moments of joy and beauty he had found along the way. He told her about his mother, about her strength and her singing voice, and the way she had always found a way to smile even in the darkest times. He told her about his dreams for the future, about wanting to have his own small ranch someday, a place where he could put down roots and build something lasting. Violet, in turn, opened up about her own past, about her mother's death and her father's descent into alcoholism and gambling. She told him about the shame she had felt, the way she had internalized the idea that her father's failures were somehow her fault, that if she had just been a better daughter or worked harder or loved him more, he would not have turned out the way he did. "That is not how it works," Yates said gently when she confessed this one afternoon as they sat on a hillside overlooking the ranch. "Your father's choices were his own. They had nothing to do with you or anything you did or didn't do. You were just a child, and even now you are barely more than that. You couldn't have saved him from himself. Nobody could." "I know that in my head," Violet said, pulling up blades of grass and letting them drift away on the breeze. "But my heart hasn't quite caught up yet." Yates reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was not the first time they had held hands, but each time still sent a thrill through her that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. "Give it time," he said. "Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small steps, bit by bit, until one day you wake up and realize the weight you have been carrying is a little bit lighter." They sat in silence for a while, hands linked, watching the cattle graze in the valley below and the clouds drift across the endless blue sky. Violet found herself thinking about the future in a way she never had before, imagining a life that extended beyond just surviving day to day. She imagined waking up beside Yates every morning, building a home with him, maybe having children someday. It was a dangerous thing to let herself want, dangerous to let herself hope for something that might not happen, but she could not seem to help herself. "Yates," she said quietly, not looking at him because she was afraid if she did she would lose her nerve. "What are we doing? Where is this going?" She felt him tense beside her, and for a horrible moment she thought she had pushed too hard, asked for too much too soon. But then he squeezed her hand and said, "I have been asking myself the same question. I have been trying to take things slow, to give you time to figure out what you want without pressuring you. But the truth is, Violet, I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you standing in that town square, looking so proud and brave even though you must have been terrified." Violet's breath caught in her throat and she finally turned to look at him. His face was serious, his eyes intense as they met hers. "I love you," he continued. "I know it is fast and probably foolish, and I know I don't have much to offer you right now. I don't have a horse or a gun or any real savings. All I have is this job and whatever I can build from here. But if you will have me, if you are willing to take a chance on me, I promise I will spend the rest of my life proving that you are worth more than all I own. Because you are. You are worth everything." Tears spilled down Violet's cheeks, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so scared to say it, so scared to admit it even to myself because I didn't want to get hurt. But I do. I love you, Yates Vinson, and I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Yates leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, but Violet met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and hope, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. "So what happens now?" Violet asked, her voice shaky but happy. "Now we take it one day at a time," Yates said, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. "We keep working, keep saving money. When I have enough put aside, I will buy another horse and save some more. Eventually, if Mrs. Colton is willing, maybe we can lease some of her land and start building our own small herd. It will take time, maybe years, but we will get there." "Together," Violet said firmly. "Together," Yates agreed. They told Mrs. Colton about their feelings for each other that evening after supper, and if she was surprised, she hid it well. In fact, she looked downright pleased, her stern face softening into a genuine smile. "I had a feeling this was coming," she said. "You two are good for each other. I can see it in the way you work together, the way you support each other. That is the foundation of a good marriage, not just romance but genuine partnership and respect." "We are not engaged yet," Yates said quickly. "I want to save up enough to buy a ring first, and to make sure I can support a wife properly before I ask Violet to marry me." "That is very honorable," Mrs. Colton said. "But don't wait too long. Life is short and uncertain, especially out here. When you know something is right, sometimes you just have to take the leap." Over the following months, as fall turned to winter, and then winter began to soften into early spring, Yates and Violet's relationship deepened and grew. They were careful to maintain propriety, knowing that Mrs. Colton trusted them and not wanting to abuse that trust. but they also found countless small ways to show their love for each other. Yates worked harder than ever, taking on extra tasks and responsibilities to earn additional money. He was saving every penny he could, and Violet did the same, setting aside most of her wages and spending only what was absolutely necessary. Mrs. Colton, seeing their dedication and their plans for the future, began teaching Yates more about the business side of ranching, about how to manage cattle and finances, and deal with buyers and markets. In March of 1884, nearly a year after the day Violet had almost been sold in Bisbee, Yates asked her to take a walk with him after Sunday supper. Violet knew something was different the moment she saw him, could see the nervous energy in the way he moved and the brightness in his eyes. He led her to their favorite spot on the hillside overlooking the ranch, where they had shared their first kiss and so many conversations since then. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple, and the air was finally warm again after the cold winter months. "Violet Brennan," Yates said, taking both of her hands in his and dropping to one knee. "I know I am not much. I am just a cowboy who lost everything and had to start over from nothing. But with your love and your support, I have built something here that I am proud of. I have saved enough money to buy a horse and a ring, and Mrs. Colton has agreed to lease us some land at a fair price where we can start our own small ranch. I don't have much to offer you yet, but I promise I will spend every day of my life working to give you the life you deserve. Will you marry me?" He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun and sparkled with promise. It was not a fancy ring or an expensive one, but to Violet it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen because it represented everything they had worked toward, everything they hoped to build together. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Yates, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply as the sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. They were married in early April in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Colton, Joe, Pete, and a few neighbors in attendance. Violet wore a new dress she had made herself, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and Yates wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed until they looked almost new. They said their vows in the parlor of the main house, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, everyone cheered. Mrs. Colton had prepared a wedding feast that covered the entire dining table, and they celebrated long into the evening with music and dancing and stories. It was one of the happiest days of Violet's life, made even more special by the fact that it was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about them and wanted to see them succeed. Mrs. Colton had a wedding present for them as well. She took them aside during the celebration and told them that she was giving them a small cabin on the far edge of her property, one that had been used for storage but could be fixed up into a proper home. "It will need work," she said, "but it is yours free and clear for as long as you want it. And the land we talked about leasing. Consider the first year's rent waived as my wedding gift to you. You too have earned it." Yates and Violet were overwhelmed by her generosity, both of them hugging the older woman and thanking her through tears. Mrs. Colton just patted them both on the back and told them to stop being sentimental and get back to enjoying their party. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, which Mrs. Colton had somehow found time to clean out and furnish with a real bed and some basic furniture. It was not fancy, but it was theirs, And as Violet lay in Yates's arms that night, listening to his heartbeat and feeling safer and more loved than she ever had in her life, she knew that every hardship she had endured had been worth it to bring her to this moment. The first years of their marriage were not easy. Building a ranch from scratch, even a small one, was backbreaking work that required long hours and constant attention. But Yates and Violet worked side by side, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating together when things went well. They slowly built up their herd, buying a few cattle here and there when they had the money, learning through trial and error how to manage their land and their resources. Mrs. Colton was a constant source of advice and support, treating them more like family than employees. She taught Violet more about ranching, encouraging her to learn to ride and to understand the business side of things so she could be a true partner to Yates. She also lent Yates money at fair terms when they needed to make larger purchases, trusting them to pay her back when they could. In the spring of 1885, Violet discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They were still struggling financially, still working to establish their ranch, and the thought of adding a baby to the mix was daunting. But Mrs. Colton assured them that they would manage, that people had been raising children in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time, and that love and determination mattered more than money. Their son was born in December of that year, arriving during a cold snap that froze the water in the buckets and made the whole world seem brittle and harsh. But inside their little cabin, warmed by a roaring fire and filled with the sound of a newborn's cries, everything felt perfect and right. They named him Zachary Thomas Vinson, after Yates's father, whom he had never known, and Violet's grandfather, who had been kind to her when she was very small. Violet proved to be a natural mother, patient and nurturing despite her own inexperience. Yates was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, singing to him and telling him stories and promising him a future that would be better than either of his parents had known growing up. The next few years passed in a happy blur of hard work and small triumphs. Their ranch slowly grew, their herd increasing bit by bit, until they were actually making a modest profit. They paid back Mrs. Colton with interest, though she tried to tell them the interest was not necessary. They improved their cabin, adding a second room for Zachary and fixing up all the little things that had been left undone in their rush to just make the place livable. In 1887, Violet gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Alina Rose, after both of their mothers. She had Violet's green eyes and Yates's stubborn chin, and from the moment she arrived she was clearly going to be a force to be reckoned with. Zachary, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help take care of her and protect her from imaginary dangers. Life was good, better than either Yates or Violet had dared to dream during those dark days in Bisbee. They had built something real and lasting, a home and a family and a future. They had faced hardships and setbacks, times when it seemed like they might lose everything they had worked for, but they had always managed to pull through because they had each other. Mrs. Colton remained a central figure in their lives, a surrogate grandmother to their children and a trusted friend and advisor. She was getting older now, moving a bit slower and delegating more of the physical work to her hands, but her mind was as sharp as ever and her generosity never wavered. In the spring of 1889, Mrs. Colton called Yates and Violet to the main house for what she said was an important discussion. They went with some trepidation, worried that something might be wrong, but Mrs. Colton greeted them with a smile and invited them to sit down. "I am getting old," she said without preamble. "I will be 60 this year and I am tired. I have been running this ranch for almost 20 years now, and I think it is time for me to step back and let younger people take over." "What are you saying?" Yates asked, his voice cautious. "I am saying that I want to sell you the ranch," Mrs. Colton said. "Not just lease the land you are working, but the entire property. The main house, the outbuildings, all the land and cattle, everything." Violet and Yates stared at her in shock. "Mrs. Colton, we could never afford that," Yates said finally. "Even if we sold everything we own, we wouldn't have enough for a down payment on a spread this size." "I am not asking you to pay me all at once," Mrs. Colton said patiently. "I am proposing that you make payments over time, at terms we can all agree on. And I am not going anywhere. I will keep living in the main house, in the back rooms where I don't need much space, and you and Violet and the children can have the rest of it. I will still be here to help and advise, but the ranch will be yours to run as you see fit." "Why?" Violet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for us?" Mrs. Colton's expression softened. "Because you two remind me of my husband and me when we were young. Because you have worked harder than anyone I have ever known, and you deserve a chance to build something lasting for your children. And because I trust you to take care of this place and preserve what my husband and I built here. This ranch is my legacy, and I want it to go to people who will love it and care for it the way I have." There were tears in everyone's eyes as they worked out the details of the agreement. The price Mrs. Colton was asking was more than fair, almost absurdly generous given the size and value of the property. They would make annual payments, and if they could not pay in a given year due to circumstances beyond their control, Mrs. Colton agreed to be flexible and work with them. They signed the papers in town the following week, and just like that, Yates and Violet Vinson became ranch owners. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exciting all at once. They had gone from having nothing to owning hundreds of acres of land and a thriving cattle operation. It was more than either of them had ever dreamed possible. True to her word, Mrs. Colton stayed on at the ranch, living in the back rooms of the house and serving as an advisor and surrogate grandmother to Zachary and Alina. She taught the children to read and write, told them stories about the old days when the territory was wild and dangerous, and instilled in them the same values of hard work and integrity that she had passed on to their parents. Yates and Violet threw themselves into running the ranch with the same determination and energy they had brought to building their own small operation. They were fair employers, treating their hands with respect and paying them decent wages. They were careful stewards of the land, not overgrazing or depleting resources, but managing things sustainably for the long term. And they were devoted parents, making sure their children understood the value of hard work, but also knew they were loved and supported unconditionally. In 1891, Violet gave birth to their third child, another son they named Daniel Matthew. He was a calm, quiet baby who seemed content to observe the world around him with serious, dark eyes that reminded Violet of her mother. Zachary and Alina, now 6 and 4 respectively, were delighted to have another sibling and immediately appointed themselves as his protectors and teachers. The ranch continued to prosper under Yates and Violet's management. They diversified their operations, adding horses to their cattle and experimenting with growing hay and other crops in the irrigated bottomlands. They built a new barn and expanded the corrals, invested in better breeding stock, and slowly but surely paid down their debt to Mrs. Colton. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when drought made everything more difficult, when cattle prices dropped and money was tight, when illness swept through the herd and threatened to wipe out everything they had built. But through it all, Yates and Violet faced each challenge together, supporting each other and finding solutions where others might have given up. In the summer of 1895, Mrs. Colton passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 66. Her death hit the whole family hard. She had been such a central figure in their lives for so long that it was hard to imagine the world without her in it. They buried her in the small cemetery on the ranch property, next to her husband, who had been laid to rest there almost 20 years earlier. In her will, Mrs. Colton forgave the remaining balance on the ranch debt and left her personal possessions to be divided between Yates and Violet and their children. She also left a letter for them, written in her careful handwriting, expressing her love and pride in what they had accomplished and her confidence that they would continue to care for the ranch and each other in the years to come. Violet read that letter over and over in the days and weeks after Mrs. Colton's death, drawing strength from the older woman's words and the knowledge that she had made such a positive impact on someone she admired so much. It helped ease the grief and made her determined to live up to the faith Mrs. Colton had placed in them. As the children grew older, they each took on more responsibilities around the ranch. Zachary, serious and hardworking like his father, showed a natural talent for working with horses and cattle. Eleanor, spirited and independent like her mother, preferred the business side of things, keeping the accounts and negotiating with buyers and suppliers with a shrewdness that made her parents proud. Daniel, the quiet observer, turned out to have a gift for understanding animals and the land, noticing things others missed and coming up with creative solutions to problems. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Yates and Violet celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the territory. Their children, now ranging in age from 14 down to 8, helped prepare for the celebration, and the ranch house was filled with laughter and music and the warmth of community. As Violet stood on the porch that evening, watching Yates dance with Eleanor while Zachary played his fiddle and Daniel clapped along, she found herself thinking back to that terrible day in Bisbee, 16 years earlier. She remembered standing in the town square, believing her life was over, feeling worthless and abandoned. And then Yates had appeared, a stranger who saw her value when even her own father did not, who was willing to give up everything he owned to save her from a fate worse than death. He had told her that day that she was worth more than all he owned, and he had spent every day since then proving those words true. But what he might not have realized, what she hoped he knew in his heart, was that he had given her something infinitely more valuable than freedom. He had given her hope and love, and a reason to believe that she deserved good things. The ranch they had built together was impressive, worth far more than Yates's old horse and saddle and gun had been. But it was not the monetary value that mattered. What mattered was what it represented. Years of hard work and sacrifice, of supporting each other through good times and bad, of building something lasting that would carry on long after they were gone. Their children would inherit this land, this legacy of love and determination. They would tell their own children about the day their grandfather gave up everything for their grandmother, about how he had seen her worth when no one else did. And those children would pass the story on to their children, and so on down through the generations, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in dollars and cents. Yates caught her eye from across the porch and smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. He excused himself from Eleanor and came to stand beside Violet, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "How far we have come," she said, leaning into his embrace. "How different everything could have been if you had not been there that day." "But I was there," he said simply. "And I would do it all again, every single moment, because it brought me to this. To you, to our children, to this life we have built. You are worth everything I gave up, Violet, and so much more." She turned in his arms and kissed him, not caring that their children and all their guests could see. After 15 years of marriage, she still felt that same flutter of excitement in her stomach when he held her, that same sense of rightness and belonging that she had felt the first time they held hands on that hillside. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he replied. Always. The party continued late into the night, and long after their guests had gone home and their children had fallen asleep, Yates and Violet sat together on the porch, watching the stars and talking about their dreams for the future. They talked about seeing their children grow up and start families of their own, about maybe traveling one day to see parts of the country they had only heard about growing old together on this land they loved. The years that followed brought changes, as all years do. Arizona became a state in 1912, bringing new opportunities and challenges. The children grew up and made their own choices. Zachary took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, eventually marrying a school teacher from Tucson and bringing her home to the ranch where they raised their own family. Alina shocked everyone by going to college, one of the first women from their area to do so, before returning home to help expand the ranch's business into new markets. Daniel studied agriculture and brought new techniques and ideas that helped improve their yields and sustainability. Through it all, Yates and Violet remained the heart of the family, the foundation on which everything else was built. They grew older together, their hair turning gray and their bodies moving a bit slower, but their love never dimming. They still took walks together on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, still held hands and stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still supported each other through whatever challenges arose. In 1923, as they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to honor them. There were speeches and toasts, stories told and retold about the early days and all the obstacles they had overcome. But the moment Violet treasured most came late in the evening when Yates pulled her aside, away from the crowd, and led her out to their favorite hillside overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, just as it had been on the evening he proposed, painting the sky in those same brilliant colors. But now, instead of a small cabin and a handful of cattle, they looked down on a thriving ranch with multiple buildings, large herds, and irrigated fields. They could see their children and grandchildren moving around below, the next generations who would carry on what they had started. "We did it," Yates said softly, his arm around her shoulders. "We built something that will last." "We did," Violet agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Thank you, Yates, for that day in Bisbee, for every day since then, for loving me and believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "You gave me a purpose," he said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, moving from place to place with no real direction. But loving you, building this life with you, raising our children together, that gave my life meaning. So thank you too, Violet, for taking a chance on a cowboy who had nothing to offer but his heart." They stood there until the last light faded from the sky and the stars came out, just as they had done so many times over the past 4 decades. And when they finally walked back down to join their family, their hands were still linked, their steps still in sync. Two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate pasts. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1927, at the age of 69. He had lived to see all 3 of his children married with families of their own, had held all 7 of his grandchildren, and told them stories about the old days. He had built a legacy that would endure for generations, not just in the land and cattle and buildings, but in the values he had instilled in his children and grandchildren about hard work, integrity, and the importance of seeing the worth in every person. Violet lived for another 8 years after Yates's death, remaining active in ranch affairs and continuing to be the matriarch of their growing family. She never remarried, never even considered it. Yates had been her one great love, and she was content to spend her remaining years remembering their time together and watching their legacy continue to grow. She passed away on a warm spring morning in 1935, surrounded by her children and many of her grandchildren. Her last words were about Yates, about how she would see him again soon and how she had never stopped loving him, not for a single moment of the 48 years they had known each other. They buried her beside Yates on the hillside overlooking the ranch, the spot where he had proposed and where they had spent so many quiet evenings together over the years. At her funeral, Zachary told the story of how his father had given up everything he owned to save his mother from being sold like property, how he had declared that she was worth more than all he owned, and how he had spent the rest of his life proving those words true. It was a story that would be passed down through the generations, told and retold at family gatherings, and used as an example of what real love looked like. The ranch itself remained in the family, each generation adding their own improvements and innovations, but always maintaining the core values that Yates and Violet had established. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, and the sun set in brilliant colors across the western sky, sometimes the family members working on the ranch would swear they could feel the presence of those two pioneers who had built everything from nothing, whose love story had become the foundation of their family's history. They could almost see Yates and Violet standing hand in hand on that hillside, looking down with pride and satisfaction at what they had created together. Proof that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold, only earned through love, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in another person's worth. The story of Violet Brennan and Yates Vinson became part of the lore of Bisbee and the surrounding territory, a reminder of a time when the West was still wild and untamed, when people's character mattered more than their bank accounts, and when a cowboy could give up everything he owned and still consider himself the richest man in the world because he had won the heart of the woman he loved. Their legacy lived on not just in the ranch that bore their name or the descendants who carried their blood, but in the example they had set of what it meant to truly value another human being, to see their worth not in what they could provide or how they could be used, but simply in who they were as a person deserving of dignity, respect, and love.